So today's meeting is all about Patrick McHardy and essentially what this incident of a multi-year copyright troll can teach us around open source. The McHardy story has been spoken about in the media. There have been some legal analysis, but today we wanted to do something a little bit different. Armijn, who has experience across the whole range of the McHardy time, the way it was addressed, Armijn is going to talk about the technical aspects of what happened with this copyright troll and what that means. Not just in the sense of what the past meant, but what it could mean for the future as well. Now, before we start this webinar, I'm going to show our antitrust policy notice. We display this at the beginning of every meeting. You'll find a link to the antitrust policy on that slide. And if you're from a Linux Foundation member company, you can contact our counsel, Andy Updegrove, with any questions. But the star of the show today is not our antitrust policy notice. It's Armijn and his technical analysis of the McHardy story. Armijn, the floor is yours.
All right, so can you hear me?
Perfectly.
Good. So I hope it will be a little bit less boring than your antitrust notice.
That's
all right.
possible.
So just checking, can you see the slides?
Yes, perfectly.
Good, good. All right. So I know that as Shane said, the McHardy story has been repeated for many years. So I've given tons of talks about this, and I'm actually I was getting a little bit sick of it, but there were still a few things that I haven't shared, and I thought it might be interesting to actually look at that. So first, a little bit about me. I am definitely an engineer, not a lawyer. Some of the claims to fame that I've had. So I was on the core team of GPLviolations.org. So I was actually doing enforcement for a number of years in Germany. So I know that I know how the process of enforcement works. So these days I'm mostly helping companies with making sure they're not getting sued for in an enforcement case. So I'm doing things like rebuilds before products go to market. I fight trolls, I do audits, and so on. I'm working on tooling. So one of the things that I'm working on is a new binary scanner, which I will talk about a lot at the Open Compliance Summit virtually in Japan in, I believe, mid-December.
That's right, December 16th.
16th. So I will then be giving a talk about that then. And I'm also still dabbling with NixOS, a Linux distribution that is completely about reproducible builds. So that's enough about me. So, but let's dive a little bit deeper into the Patrick McHardy story. So a few years ago, there was a lot of, I think you can say, a bit of a scare about Patrick McHardy and his enforcement tactics. So he was definitely rocking the world. And the thing is that before, and there was enforcement being done, but that was always more or less in connection to a community or and with a community goal in mind. But McHardy actually was completely disconnected, and he actively actively cut off ties with the community. He wasn't talking with other people at all. So I know that quite a few people actually tried to reach out to him and to start a conversation by saying, yo, what you're doing is not helping, but he didn't want to talk. So that was a big difference, actually. And so I helped, I don't know how many companies to fight him off. So just a while ago, I was going through some old invoices for my administration, and I saw invoices to companies and thought, like, what did I do for them? Turned out it was a McHardy case. I did so many, I just forgot the names and the products of what I did, because it was just sometimes there were 3-4 calls per day from a lawyer saying, well, I've got a new case. It was that much coming in bursts, so I forgot a lot about the specifics of the companies. So the good news for me in my amount of sleep is that he no longer seems to be active. So the last known enforcement cases are from July 2020. So that's 1.5 years ago. There are still a few things that are being wrapped up. One case is currently under appeal at the Hamburg Court of Appeal, and that's progressing very, very slowly. But I think that there are some valuable lessons that can be learned. So I very briefly want to discuss the background of the troll, the copyrights that are involved. I will very, very shortly touch upon the methods that he used, and then focus on the methods that I used to basically, well, deconstruct Patrick McHardy. And I will also talk a little bit more about how in the end we beat him, which is probably a little bit anticlimactic, but let's see. So Patrick McHardy is, despite the name, he's German. He's a German developer, German citizen, and he contributed to several open source projects for which he did enforcement. So the most well-known ones are the Linux kernel and the NetFilter project, but also IP route, BusyBox, libnl. And he also has some copyrights or claims copyrights where he didn't do any enforcement. So I know that he has one patch in PostgreSQL, and there are a number of other things where he has made a few contributions. So he wasn't always a troll. So when I looked into his history, it's that he got involved in several projects. At one point became the NetFilter lead. Then he completely vanished and just completely dropped off the planet. Then he returned, he started doing enforcement, and eventually got expelled by NetFilter and also others. So the first contribution the first Linux kernel release with one of his code contributions is 2.4.19. So I did a little bit of research, and it's very likely that during this time he might have worked as an intern or as a student or something. So the first patches to NetFilter appeared in June 2002. And then he seems to have been employed by a company called CoreWorks, maybe as an employee, maybe as an owner. I don't know. There's absolutely nothing that can be found about that company, but there is this fairly well-known file server, which was quite popular in Germany at around that time, Ben-Hur. That was a product from a company called Pyramid, I believe, and that is one of the things that he apparently worked on. So for his copyrights in the enforcement cases, it depends a little bit on the case. So in some cases, he said that he owned all of the copyrights from 2002 onwards. In other cases, when we started pressing him for it, then he said that it was from kernel 2.6.3 at the latest, which would have been, I believe, March 2006. So from 2007 until 2013, he was the lead at NetFilter, even though by 2011, Pablo Nera had taken over this responsibility because McHardy had just completely dropped off the planet. And I can actually show that, and I will show that later in this talk. So the enforcement work started in mid-2012 and continued, as said, until mid-2020. But I do know that he was already aware of the enforcement because he was part of the NetFilter core team. And Harald Welte actually did some cases in the name of the NetFilter core team back in 2004. So then there was a Welte versus Sitecom. So if you look at the press releases from that time, then it actually says that it was the NetFilter core team against Sitecom. So he was very well aware of that there was already enforcement happening, because I know that Harald actually shared progress with the team, or at least, I mean, it would have been highly unlikely that he was unaware of that. So in July 2012, there was the first known enforcement case. And we know because at that same time at gplviolations.org, we were doing enforcement against the same company. So then we knew like, okay, well, there's someone else doing enforcement, also for NetFilter, also for the Linux kernel. And then it stayed quiet for a while, it seemed. And the first case that I was involved in was in December 2013. But later on, I learned that he actually had gone after quite a few companies between July 2012 and December 2013. So in the period of 2013 and 2017, there was increased enforcement. There were a few court cases. Large amounts of money were paid to McHardy. So a conservative estimate is €2 million, and I can tell you that that is a conservative estimate, definitely. So I know some companies that paid a lot for no reason at all. So in retrospect. So I know that especially 2016 was super busy for me in that respect. There were tons of cases. In 2017, people started to really notice and fight back. So he was removed from the NetFilter core team. There was a Linux kernel community statement. There were a few other things. But what was pivotal is that in October 2017, there was a court against Geniatech, and in March 2018, there was an appeal. And that appeal hearing was something to behold. that was really special. And since then, he basically, well, we ridiculed him. And after that, there were many cases where he started demanding less and less money. Sometimes he's just stopped pursuing companies, or simply dropped cases because people just basically said, no, go away. And he just went away. And I know that instead of tens of thousands of euros, he basically started settling for hundreds of euros instead. So it was definitely a game changer. And as said, there's currently an appeal at the Hamburg court. I talked to a lawyer yesterday who knows a little bit more about that, and there's still no news about it, even though I think the hearing should have been somewhere in November 2 years ago. So that one is really dragging out for a very long time. So people keep asking me, like, were all the cases in Germany, or were there any other jurisdictions? But all of the cases were in Germany for a few reasons. So first of all, he's a German citizen, makes it a little bit easier. But it's also common in Germany to, when you go after a company, to sign a cease and desist with a contractual penalty. And a contractual penalty is something that he really abused, I would say. So what he would do is he would use the so-called salami technique. He would find a device, or at some point he would just stop doing test purchases and just focused on downloadable firmware. You find a device with Linux that didn't comply with the license terms. He would send a demand letter with a declaration to cease and desist, including a contractual penalty clause. And then he would wait some time until the company would trip, because they all would, unless they really took care, they all would trip. And then he would come back to collect the contractual penalty, and so on, and so on, and so on. And then we just, I know that some companies were hit 4 or 5 times. So that's also a little bit on them, but because they didn't take care. But yeah, that this is something that he abused. Just come back, collect the contractual penalty, sign a new declaration to cease and desist with a higher penalty, and so on. So this method works because it is, as said, quite normal practice in Germany. And as soon as you have signed a agreement to cease and desist with a contractual penalty and you breach it, it's no longer about compliance, but it's actually a contractual dispute. So it's different. And it's no longer about, well, whether or not he has copyrights, whether or not he wrote that code. It's purely about a breach of contract. So, and also one of the things that helped him is that Harald and gplviolations.org, we pioneered this space successfully. Of course, we did it for another reason, but the courts were aware of cases and a little bit about how the GPL worked. Not in detail, of course, but there were plenty of cases where we actually had gone to court and won. And also we did it very carefully, but there was some, I'm not sure if you could call it prior art. I'm not sure if you can even call it art, but there were prior cases. So the climate was quite friendly to doing enforcement. So I don't know about the number of cases before 2018, but I'm quite sure about the cases from 2018 onward, because his lawyer used a numbering scheme, and from that we can at least derive a bottom threshold of or estimate of the number of cases that we know. So we know that there were at least 51 known cases in 2018, 19, and 20. Very likely there are another 20 that we can derive from based on the numbering scheme that his lawyer uses. And in the years before, there were at least 25 cases, but I must warn you that this is a very conservative estimate. So so there were at least 100 cases, and probably there were many, many more. So from 2012 until 2020, at least 100 cases, but likely it could easily be double. It could be 150. I don't know, but quite a few. So the thing is that it all started to change in 2017, first slowly and then a lot quicker. So his downfall began in 2017 when people started to talk more publicly about McHardy. So I had already done countless talks by then in private, so at private workshops, at companies or at conferences, which were not public, except for one talk. So the earliest public talk that I gave was actually in late 2015 in Korea. There's one organization that's saying that they are the first ones, so they're the first to publicly talk about McHardy. I just want to set the record straight. That is not true. That actually was me. But it all started basically with a panel at the Legal and Licensing Workshop in April 2017 that was publicly reported. So LWN.net reported on that panel. So that was a panel by Mark Radcliffe, Shane, and myself. Heather Meeker wrote an article about on opensource.com in August 2017. And then there was the McHardy versus Guinea Tech Europe case in October 2017. And this all made it much, much easier to talk about these cases and to share information. So McHardy versus Guinea Tech Europe was, in my eyes, pivotal. So the manager, he was a very interesting person, by the way, very nice guy, but he decided to go public and just shine a light on McHardy and his methods, because he basically called all his journalist friends and saying, I've got something interesting for you. So the people at they started to talk about it, especially after they lost the first case. And they even managed to interview McHardy to get his so the journalists actually they succeeded where we didn't succeed by getting hold of him. But so they actually got to interview McHardy and publish about it. And this all made it very, very easy, much easier for us. So the appeal hearing in March 2018, when we actually entered the courtroom, the judge was like, whoa, that's a lot of people. Because normally there's actually no one there, or maybe one or two. And then when people who are attending are usually, students who need to know more about a specific case or about a certain aspect of intellectual property law and are sent there by their professors to observe. But now the whole room was just packed with something like 40 or 50 people. So there were lawyers, there were engineers, and there were journalists. And for McHardy, this was just very intimidating. And after just 15 minutes or so, he just dropped the case, or at least his lawyer dropped the case. So, and then afterwards, he was basically just the laughing stock. So it showed to the entire industry that it was possible to successfully fight back and win. So technically, he withdrew the case, but this case damaged his business model a lot. So before, companies were actually scared, and they now just challenged him and said, well, no. So the lawyer who did that case, of course, he got then loads of questions from other companies, and his standard response would be like, no, you can go away. And in many cases, McHardy would just go away, and there would be no settlement. So many cases were, missed the word there. So he also dropped many cases where companies decided to put a fight and so on. So a lesson that was learned there is that sometimes it is better to talk about threats than just to be secretive, like, oh, we don't want people to know that we are being sued. So this might be difficult maybe for companies that are listed on the stock market, or maybe, but still. And this was a small company with a manager who basically said, screw this, screw you, McHardy, and just started involving journalists, and then just basically his whole business model went poof. So the demand letters were quite interesting. They always had a few claims that it started with, like, oh, McHardy is one of the most prolific or most important Linux kernel contributors there ever was. And also things like the Linux kernel is a joint work. McHardy is a co-author. And then, well, your product uses blah. Just without any other proof, he would say, well, your product uses Linux or IP-Write 2 or BusyBox and so on. And these letters looked very intimidating because they seemed to be well prepared, because there was a Git primer, there were Git metrics and so on. But on closer inspection, these claims were not as strong as claimed. For example, what he would show were generic Git statistics or Git blame logs that were not specific to the device that he actually, for which he was enforcing. There would be sets of commit logs which would not be filtered for the code that was actually used in the device and so on. So he made it seem like it was a lot bigger than he actually was. So in his enforcement, he mostly focused on the non-technical things, like a license text or a written offer. And if those things were actually there, he would push for build scripts. So basically, the lowest thing that or the easiest thing that he could find, he would not do a full technical analysis. So what he always would also send was a zip file with a few things like a copy of the files from the Linux kernel used in the device, but without any annotation. So he would basically just copy them from a Git checkout, but without any of the Git blame output. So he would not see like, okay, well, I contributed to line 10 or so. No, it would just be the plain file without any additional context. He would also include the Git short log and the change log for the kernel that was used in the device, but they would be basically containing all of the Git commits, and they were not filtered for the specific files. So if you would actually want to know, like, okay, well, is any of this in our device, you would have to redo all of that work. And it would not make it easy for you. And whether or not he had authored those files, that was usually not contested by or just even discussed by my clients. But in the cases when we did push back, the reactions were usually quite strange. Well, we'll dive into that a little bit later. So some of the metrics that he sent, he would, for example, send things like, okay, well, these are the changes that I contributed to between the Linux 3.2 and 3.3 kernel, and so many percent of the changes in these directories were mine. Of course, if you know the Linux kernel, you will see that this is just a small subset of all the directories in the Linux kernel. So this looks very intimidating, but then there are now another 100 directories that he didn't actually contribute to. And he would even send this stuff if your device was running, I don't know, 4.0.10. So this would be completely useless. Like, oh, well, you know, I made this many changes to version X and you would be running version Y, something completely different. So he had everything like that was just prepared beforehand. And it was basically just, okay, well, we've got this generic document that we're going to send to everyone. And that was it. So it was, I think that he usually did very, very little research on the devices that he was enforcing his copyrights for, or his alleged copyrights, I must say. So one of the things is that in one case, he decided to fax 1,400 or 1,300 pages to the court, which the court then, or the law firm then, of course, printed. And this was just basically unannotated versions of the files that he contributed to in the Linux kernel. So this was just basically printed out Linux kernel source code without any information about which line he contributed to, so completely useless. That was just purely intimidation. So in early 2019, I decided to do a very deep dive into all of these claims from McHardy, just to see how far off he was. So I basically spent 1.5 months full time, including the weekends, to assemble an extensive report, so at least 130 pages. And this barely scratches the surface. It was just I wouldn't say a minimal investigation, but not as deep as I would want to, because it's just very, very time consuming. But still, I can have some conclusions. So my conclusion was that McHardy vastly exaggerated his importance, and he also has claimed other people's contributions as his own. Also, what I found is that there's plenty of Linux kernel history that is murky and is impossible to reconstruct. And this worked in his favor. So in the end, this document was never used because it was 2019, which was after the McHardy case, so after the Guinea attack case. But and by that time, he already started settling and dropping cases. So, well, yeah, I spent a lot of time making a document that is for a threat that is basically no longer a threat. So, but hey, at least I have a very big document now. So one of the claims is that McHardy is a very important Linux kernel author. And one claim was that he was that, and also because he was the NetFilter team lead, and also that he was a maintainer of the net directory until his removal in 2017. And this was stressed very, very often. And one of the claims to joint authorship is that the design of the Linux kernel was discussed on mailing lists and at conferences, that McHardy participated in both. And because he was the team lead of NetFilter, he made all of these design decisions. And because he was a maintainer, he also made lots of code decisions and so on. So I just decided to look at his contributions to the Linux kernel, his role as a maintainer, his email list behavior, conference attendance, and so on. So one of the things that I did is to look at the Git commits. So his first commit was in 2002. And the claim letters that he sent, they contained Git commits and statistics and lists of files that he allegedly wrote or contributed to. But he ignored contributions from other authors. So sometimes it was just a one-liner that he in a file of, I don't know, 100 or 200 lines, then would say, well, I'm an author to this, even though it was just a very, very small contribution. He also ignored that some of the files that he contributed to predated his contributions by at least a decade. And he also claimed contributions from other origins, namely from the BSD project. So this makes the claim of being a joint author very, very dubious. So at most, he created a derivative work and was what they call in German Bearbeiter. So an editing author, if you would translate it. So this is just a sample of some of the research that I did. I've got another 50 examples, but some of the things that he claimed were created in 1993 and his first contribution was more than 12 years later. And then there are many files that he contributed to where his first contribution was something like 5, 6, 7 years later, sometimes a few days, sometimes a few months. And in one instance, I think something, but then in another project, something like 20 years. So, I mean, trying to claim joint authorship when the original file was made 12 years before your first contribution, and something like 7 years before you're even being involved in the project, and that's bold. So he also used statistics from Git blame, which are known to be inaccurate, or at least not give you the full pictures. So one of the files that he claimed actually was just a white space check. So he said, well, I contributed to this file, particular file, and all he did was reorder and just, mostly reorder the code and add some missing spaces or delete some white space and so on. I mean, I'm sorry, but for just doing some cosmetic work, that's not creative, at least not in C, that the Linux kernel is written in. So one of the bigger commits that he claimed is a file called in Netscape, so hfsc.c. And this file is an adaptation of a file that originated in the KME project, so which was a project to bring better IPv6 support to the BSD kernels. And his adaptation was mostly like rewriting it so it could be used with the Linux kernel. And when it was imported, then at least 370 lines were identical or near identical to the BSD code. But because the history was not imported with the commit, because that Git history was not available at the time, if you now look at the Linux Git history and his statistics, it will actually see that this code was written by Patrick McHardy, even though it was false. But this did show up in his letters because he didn't do a full analysis, and he just said like, I wrote this, which is not entirely honest. So another example is that nftables was integrated into the Linux kernel in 2013. And the first commit that integrated this stuff contains contributions from at least 5 authors. But at the request of the NetDev maintainer at the time, not McHardy, but someone else, the commit was squashed and imported without the full history. And so again, if you look at Git blame in the Linux kernel, you will only see McHardy as the author, even though there are 4 other authors as well. This history seems to be lost because the Git repositories that this code originated in seem to have been removed, or at least I cannot find them. And the history should, if you want to reconstruct it, you need to dive through the NetFilter mailing lists and perhaps other patch sets or I don't know what. But just solely from Git, the current Git, you will not be able to find it, that he actually wrote a lot less than he did. So one thing that the lawyer from McHardy kept stressing is that how important McHardy's work as a maintainer was. So he made it seem like a maintainer basically meant that you are calling the shots and that you can make big design decisions about the Linux kernel and how it works. But when I was talking to Linux kernel maintainers, they said, no, that's not how it works. Basically, a Linux kernel maintainer needs to make sure that code that is merged has a certain quality, like coding style, that you're not making any dumb mistakes and so on. And that means reviewing code from other people, making suggestions, keeping an overall view of the code and architecture and so on. And even though most maintainers do code, it does not mean that you are doing the big designs and writing the code and then ordering people around to write the code and so on. Being a maintainer is more like, a janitor, an infrastructure role. So I looked at how good he was as a maintainer. So the Linux kernel has this signed off by thing that people are using. So I basically looked at all of the commits in net and looked at, so how many commits actually were there and how many did he sign off on? And it turns out that the maximum of net, then it was something like 10-15% at most. Of course, you could say, well, maybe he only focused on NetFilter and not on mostly focused on NetFilter and not on the entire network stack. Well, but he did claim that he was a maintainer of all of the networking stack. So if you would look at the statistics for other maintainers, then I mean he wasn't actually very active as a maintainer, it seemed. So I also looked at his own commits versus the signed off. So how much did he actually look at commits of other people versus his own stuff? And what I found is that at some point he mostly started focusing on his own commits, and he didn't really look that much at other people's commits, it seemed. So sometimes it was something like 60% of other people, and that's not typical maintainer, or at least not typical good maintainer behavior. So at one point he simply started, he just stopped signing off on other people's commits. So the last commit from someone else that he signed off on, where he was not the author, was in August 2012. So at these cases in 2017, the lawyer said, well, my client is a maintainer of the network stack, even though by then he had not signed off on anything from someone else for 5 years. So when you looked at the things that he signed off on, so mostly NetFilter or non-NetFilter commits, it was very clear that his focus was on NetFilter, but at some point he just basically completely stopped signing off on non-NetFilter commits as well. So I also decided to look at how does the other maintainer, so the current maintainer, how actually does he do that? And what you can see very clearly is that at some point, namely in 2011, Patrick McHardy really dropped off the planet. So if you look at this so this is per year, but if you look at per month, then you can see that in early 2011, McHardy just ceases to sign off on things. Then there's a period where almost nothing gets signed off by either Patrick or Pablo. And then just Pablo started picking up the slack. So then I also looked at how did Pablo sign off on other people's commits. And then you can see that, so I'm not sure if you can see it very well, but the purple line that is on the lower right, that is Pablo's commits. And he mostly looked at other people's commits. So he actually did do some code review, he looked at things, he made suggestions and so on, the way you would expect a maintainer to work. So my verdict for McHardy as a maintainer, no, he was not a good maintainer at all. So he looked at maximum 10-15% of the commits, often less. He increasingly focused on NetFilter and not on other parts of the networking stack. And at some point, he just stopped reviewing other people's patches and mostly focused on his own commits. This is not what you would expect from a maintainer. So by saying like, well, he was very important because he was a maintainer, well, he was not a good maintainer. And also you misunderstood the role of a maintainer. So that's completely bogus. So I also looked at the Linux kernel mailing list to see how he behaved there, because the lawyer basically kept saying like, it's a joint work because all of these decisions are basically discussed on all of these mailing lists. But he actually wasn't that active on mailing lists. So on the Linux kernel mailing lists, In 15 years, he sent less than 1,000 emails. That's not a lot. I think I send more in, well, I wouldn't say in a day, but I mean, I'm much more prolific when it comes to email. But you know, that's something like one email every 3 days. Not even, no, even way less. No, one email per week. I don't know. But if you're that important as a developer, then you would expect that you would be if you really were involved in things like designing big features, that you would be more active. So on the NetDev mailing list, it's a little bit more. Of course, on the NetFilter development mailing list, it's even more. And I'm still conflicted whether or not I think he should have sent one email more to the NetFilter developer mailing list, or if 9,999 emails is a cool number. I haven't made up my mind. So just to make sure that this also includes all of the mails that are sent with, for example, Git or another version control system with actual patch sets. So if you plot his contributions to the Linux kernel mailing list over time, then you can see very easily that the list was active for at least 8 years before. So that's the archives that they can find. And this is his performance. I wouldn't say performance, but his mailing list behavior over the years on the Linux kernel mailing list. So there was a peak around 2006. And after that, it very quickly tapered off. So if you plot with all of the mailing lists, it's the same thing. At one point, he just stopped being active at all. So around 2010, 2011, it was just this big drop in activity. And I can see that everywhere. So another thing I looked into was BusyBox, because in some of the cases, BusyBox was actually involved. And he has a single patch in BusyBox 1.22 in the file networking libip route iplink.c. This file originally showed up in BusyBox in November 2002, but it has an older origin in the IP Route 2 project, going back to at least early 99, but more likely is that it originated somewhere in 1997. And McHardy's contribution was in mid-2013. So that's something like a decade, more than a decade after the file popped up in BusyBox, and something like 15 years after it was first created. And his interaction with BusyBox was limited to 4 emails to the BusyBox mailing list, including one email that said, please CC me when answering because I'm not on the list. So if you are claiming that you're a joint author and that all of the big design decisions happen on a mailing list, and then you're saying, well, please CC me because I'm not on the list, or at least that is what he was implying, that it was not on the list. I mean, that doesn't make you a joint author. Also, a default compilation of BusyBox will include this code, but it is fairly easy, actually very easy, to exclude it. And McHardy claimed joint authorship even if his code was not included in the actual binary. So he just basically looked at the BusyBox version number like, oh, it's 1.22 or 1.23. That means that I've copyrights in there, even if the code was not included in the binary. So that's just completely nonsense. It's like oh, you know, you're quoting something from a book on pages 1 to 10, and I wrote something in, I don't know, as a contribution on page 200. So therefore, I can enforce my rights in the first 10 pages that were written by someone else 15 years before. Like it's completely ridiculous. So especially with BusyBox, because BusyBox has lots of code from all kinds of origins, mostly BSD, including some files that date back to 1980. At that point, McHardy was 1 year old. And when you're a joint author, it means that you have to make all of these decisions and design decisions. Can you actually imagine him being 1 years old and making these design decisions with the big Unix gurus? I mean, it's ridiculous. So fighting back with technical claims is something that we sometimes try to do, but the answers were just ridiculous. So instead of saying some stuff like some technical details like, well, you know, we actually have found this code in this program at byte offset, blah, 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 and this matches with the source code file, this source code file with this checksum at this line, and you can find all of the information in this git commit. He would not even do that. What he would do is he would try to personally attack me, saying that, oh, Mr. Himmel is not a kernel developer, therefore he cannot comment on this. Stuff like that. Or when we used a report from Linux Foundation, he would attack Linux Foundation that it could not be trusted because they had nixed the community chair that Karen Sandler wanted to run for. I mean, completely non-technical things. And of course, this typical troll behavior to confuse the courts because they don't have a lot of technical expertise, which is a shame. So in the end, we didn't use the technical claims, but if we did, I think that likely we would have crushed him in court. I mean, we had so much evidence, and we could have hit him around, but something tells me that he never wanted that to happen, because probably he knew that he was that his claims were a lot weaker than he thought. So, and then the question is what to do when dealing with a troll like McHardy. So I think that McHardy is gone now. But when confronted with a GPL troll, I think that you need to spend some time to research all of the technical claims that are made and claims of authorship, because that makes it a lot easier to focus on things. Make sure that you have enough documentation ready to fight back in case you need it. So even though we never needed it, I had this document of nearly 140 pages, just chock full of technical stuff. And you need to keep asking for clear technical proof and make the troll do a lot of the work as well. So McHardy never did any of the technical work. It's like, oh yeah, I found this, blah, 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 blah. And never like, okay, in this particular binary at this line, you can find blah. Never did that. So you need to keep pushing them, saying, well, okay, prove it. And I think that in case of a real troll, just like a real troll, like a McHardy troll, share your information, share your info with other people, your information, just share it, or at least talk about it. Trolls do not like to have a light shown upon them. And of course, never lose your cool, which is a little bit difficult if there's a deadline and there are lawyers breathing down your neck and people shouting and also, but just do not lose your cool. A lot of these trolls are not as scary as they think. They're not as scary as you think, and not as scary as they make it seem. So in retrospect, McHardy was just a small guy, and still he did a lot of damage. So regarding this analysis that I made, my McHardy document contains many more details. I'm not going to publish it, but in case your company wants to have a full breakdown of the analysis and look at more details, then we can make an arrangement for that. So then where is McHardy now? The answer is we don't know. We really don't know. I know that at one point he claimed that he was living in Germany, even though he wasn't. People actually visited the address. It wasn't there. They looked at the city records, wasn't registered at where he said he was living. But at that time, he was living at one of the Canary Islands, not the one that is exploding, but another one. And what I heard is that he might be living in France right now, but we don't know for sure. The last enforcement letter was sent in July 2020. There's still an ongoing appeal at the Hamburg courts. And basically nothing happened in the last 18 months. The last case that I did was in April 2020, and he just dropped it. So in case he comes back, the defenses, and especially the technical defenses that we have against the McHardy, they're strong. And unless he improves his act, it's not very likely that he will ever be a threat again. But I want to remind you that there actually is other enforcement going on. There are other enforcers out there, and there might be another McHardy in the future. Who knows? That brings me to the end of this talk, and I'm ready to answer any questions.
If I could start with the first question, I guess it's a two-parter. It seems that McHardy caused chaos for years, but in the end was ultimately not the threat he could have been. I'm curious, why hasn't someone come in and been the threat he could have been?
Well, that is something that I've been thinking about as well. I mean, if you have a competent lawyer and you're doing a competent research, you could make it very painful for the entire market. Maybe the companies that are contributing, so the actual copyright holders, do not have an incentive to sue other people. Maybe their benefits that they get from Linux and open source are greater than the benefits that they would have of suing each other.
It makes sense, though it does sound like we can't be complacent.
Oh, definitely not. Definitely not. There are probably some copyright holders where it is uncertain what they would do. One thing that I'm personally worried about is there are people who actually have copyrights in core code, and they own the copyright, and they're not the youngest anymore. What happens with their copyrights when they basically start dying? That is something that is currently unresolved.
Makes sense. I'll pause there to give everyone else a chance to jump in.
I have a question. You
Go ahead.
mentioned a contractual penalty. Did any of the companies that received cease and desist letters refuse to sign the contractual penalty? And would there have been any disadvantage in refusing?
Well, the companies that refused to sign, most of them ended up in court, and depending on at what point in time and who was involved, they either lost or won, or they settled in the end. But yeah, there were companies that refused to sign the declaration to cease and desist with penalties. At one point, he also started to offer the cease and desist without the contractual penalties, and then he started to reintroduce them again. So I guess that he wanted to score a few simple wins, just get a little bit of easy cash. But yeah, so the disadvantage, I think that knowing what we know now about his copyrights and all that, I would have advised every company to refuse to sign that declaration to cease and desist and just go to court.
Thank you for your answer. Very good talk as well. Thank you very much.
Hi, this is Tiat. I have one quick question. Did you write this into an article or something that we can read again? Because I heard most of your talk, and it's really appealing to me. So I'd like to read the article if there's one.
So there are a few articles. So Shane, do you think you can send those links that I sent to you via email?
They were sent in the invite. So I'll resend those after the call as well. But I understand that you've got a detailed report, but that is a report from your consultancy, not a generally available one, right?
So the background document that I made, that is basically for my consultancy, and that is not a general overview. So the links that Shane has sent and will send again, they actually contain a general overview of all the cases and the processes.
I think general overview is good enough. Thank you.
And this is being recorded anyway, isn't it?
Yes. So another quick question there, Armijn. If McHardy comes back, what you've learned in 8 years was essentially taking him to court is the winning strategy because he doesn't have much behind him. I just want to check, what type of lawyers was he working with in Germany? Were we talking national lawyers or international firms? What type of opposition was there?
So he was working with a lawyer that apparently is a personal friend of his that was that moved from law firm to law firm until eventually he set up his own law firm together with another lawyer who was doing possibly similar work in the music industry. So it's definitely local.
It's good to know. So it's, it sounds like it's much less scary than it seemed at the time.
Yeah, and a lawyer with very little technical knowledge as far as I know.
All righty. Everyone, this is your last chance to to get some of the background on this. And I think after this, it's case closed, right, Armijn? You're basically done with talking about him, apart from one-to-ones.
Hey, Shane,
Yep.
this is Ted again. Can I ask another question? I'm not a lawyer, but I wonder if there is any similar case that that can, become a class action. I mean, from those real co-authors that sue against a certain company that in breach of the GPL or contractual stuff. Did you understand my question?
Yeah, it made a lot of sense. So basically, if I understand right, you're asking, could this come back with other people as a major case with multiple parties, right?
That's right, multiple authors. Right, you're right.
Well, I think it depends on the jurisdiction. And also you said co-authors, but the Linux kernel is not a co-authored work. So the only things that they would be able to enforce is that their own contributions. This is something, by the way, that I didn't mention, but of course, the reason that McHardy wanted it to be a co-authored work, to be seen as a co-authored work, is because then he could enforce the rights of all of the Linux kernel. The thing that he didn't like about that is that he also would have to share all of the proceedings with all of the other co-authors. That's when he basically switched back to like, no, this is mine. So he wanted the benefits of being a co-author, but not the burdens.
Makes sense. Well, I mean, it's
Okay.
terrible. But
it's terrible indeed.
So I wanted to ask another question, and that is that there's a lot of focus on GPL enforcement, and in this case, a rather malicious attempt at that. But have there been any cases of BSD license enforcement, for instance, where the only violation is not attributing the code?
I think that most of the enforcement definitely has been around GPL and LGPL, but there was something with the artistic license in the US a long time ago. But I think that most of the, almost all of the enforcement was about GPL and LGPL.
Thank you.
Well, we're at the end of the hour. If someone has a pressing question, they can ask it. If not, huge thanks, Armijn. A great summary of an 8-year epic journey. I'm glad.
I'm
glad
sorry. May I
hi.
ask a question?
Of course.
I heard the whole lesson that you shared, but I have a question. The way you beat the troll is because you have so many data collected from all the items, then the troll precipitate. But if another troll appears, how do you collect so many data in a short time?
That is a very good point. So basically the thing is that I was almost the only engineer working on the defense side, so I actually had access to a lot of the information, so I could see patterns. Yeah, that this is what I think that we do. That this is why I think we should more easily share information about threats with each other, because of course I could do another 30 cases of another troll, but preferably not. It's kind of exhausting. So I think that this is why we need to share a lot more information and just be more open about it, about the threats, because this is a shared concern and in a shared ecosystem. So I think that would be the only way, just to talk more.
Okay, thank you.
Armijn, thank you so much. And Armijn agreed to do this talk at very short notice. So, really special thanks for that. This has been recorded as usual, and we'll take that live in a few days. Thank you everyone for joining this call, and I look forward to seeing you all very soon again. Take care.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks. Great
Thank
talk.
you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for the talk.